All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all very much for coming down to the Talks event today. My name is Artur Oliveira. I'm one of the Chicago site leads for Talks at Google here in Chicago. I'm very excited about this talk today. I am going to let John Michael Schert do his own introduction because I just couldn't do it justice. But what I'm especially excited about today is this is a great opportunity to really interact with him. We have a small room, but a really good audience, so he's going to get started. He has tons of interesting content to share with you and talk with you about, but by all means, don't feel shy about asking questions, jumping in, commenting, and all of that. It's a really good opportunity that we have today. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to John Michael.
Thanks. Oh, applause. You're applauding already. I've done nothing, but thank you. So I do have two first names, John and Michael. My mom gave me that lifelong task. I grew up in South Georgia, and like most warm-blooded American boys, I started doing the Nutcracker at the age of 6, which led to a pretty interesting life. So I've been a ballet dancer now since 6 years old. I've professionally been a ballet dancer for 16 years. According to Malcolm Gladwell, I am an expert. I have put in my 45,000 hours. I've done, by my last estimate, over 300,000 pliés, which is just this, over and over and over again. So ballet, like most any other form, is highly rigorous. You can compare it to any other athletic sport. You can compare it, though, to learning any skill, whether it's a language, coding, most anything. We spend hundreds of thousands of hours figuring out the difference between this and this. That took about 10,000 hours just to get that right. So like most rigorous forms, when you're young, you're really just focusing on the form itself. It's a derivative process, right? Like you're being given this knowledge by your teachers, and they're saying, you need to do it this way, and if you don't measure up. You're not good enough. And so you're always trying to find this more extrinsically, way you're filtering this extrinsic information. It takes a long time before you start to get to that intrinsic of do you know the difference between this and this? It takes a long time before you can really feel it. We do repetition, we're doing the same thing over and over and over and over again. So I moved away from home at 14 to go to a boarding school for ballet. At 18, I moved to New York and joined American Ballet Theater, which is considered, it's like joining Google. It's one of the top. It's one of the top 5 ballet companies in the world for classical ballet. It is a very, I would say, quantitative ballet company. Again, more is more. You can measure who is better. 5 pirouettes is better than 4. The way a foot looks. My parents gave me good genetics for ballet, so my feet do what they're supposed to do, my proportions are right. In some ways, I didn't have to work as hard as some of my peers because I had a lot of aptitude. The way a foot looks, the way a leg works, how high your leg goes, those are all ways that you're evaluated and measured. ABT, American Ballet Theater, is a very hierarchical system. So I went to the summer program at the age of 16, and I met a group of colleagues, my cohort. We all joined the same day, and to this day, still one of my favorite people in the world is my good friend Misty Copeland. So we all joined the same day, age 15. At age 18, we all became members of the studio company, which is like the Young Bucks. Then we became trainees, then we became apprentices, then we became corps de ballet members, and then she became a soloist, and now she's, a principal dancer in the face of Under Armour. The way you get promoted was very much based on how do you measure up. So again, I'm going to call this the form. You had to excel at the form. You had to excel at how you processed and applied extrinsic information. You had to think quantitatively. You had to understand the objective nature of ballet more than the subjective. Most people think dancers are artists. Most dancers aren't artists, they're technicians. They're very good at applying all this information and doing it brilliantly. That wasn't enough for me. So after only a couple years at ABT, I left to join a company that was starting in New York called Cedar Contemporary Ballet. It was well known because it was, most dance companies are nonprofits, so they're funded by a variety of sources. This was funded by one woman. Her name's Nancy Walton-Laurie. She's a Walmart heiress. And I remember on the first day, she walked in with her floor-length purple mink coat and said, I own a baseball team, I own a hockey team, I own championship horses, and I own you. I was only there for 3 months. But I met a man, Alonzo King, who became really sort of my mentor, a guru almost. So I moved to San Francisco and tutored, well, I was in the company, but really it was a mentee to this man. So Alonzo was the first one to teach me the balance of what I'm going to talk about today, the balance of the creative process. So the creative process is not just all being in the right brain all the time and being in this incredible gaseous state. Has anyone read Stephen Johnson's Where Good Ideas Come From? He talks about gaseous states. They don't have as much form, a great idea and information can come, it can flow a little easier compared to like a solid state environment, which was where I was coming from, American Ballet Theater. I'm going to give the analogy of 2 feet firmly planted. That was ABT, like very much grounded. A gaseous state, of course, is just like everything's moving, everything's formless. It's all about the feeling, where ABT was all about the form. So form and feeling. Gaseous states are much more like intrinsically motivated. What are you thinking? How does this make you feel? Where are you going to go with it? Most people think artists are constantly just in this state, right? Where again, a form-based, quantitative system is much more what can you measure and what is being told to you and how are you replicating. Alonzo was the first one to really teach me the creative process is how you find this inner dialogue of form and feeling, objective perspective, subjective understanding. How are you listening while telling? How are you doing the choreography and doing it with great articulation and great, acumen, skill, using all that ability that you've been working on for all those years to make sure your thumb's not like that, but like that. But how are you, in the act of telling, like I'm going to do the step for you, how are you also having a state of reciprocal listening, where you're opening yourself up to possibility? So you're not improvising, you're not making these steps up, but it feels alive, it feels spontaneous, it feels real in this moment. Alonzo would always say, I don't want to see the steps, I want to see the ideas, right? So he's like, I don't want to go on stage and just see you doing arithmetic. Then the arm does this, and then you do that. Where at ABT, that's what they valued. No, your arm should be here, not here. It's all about placement, specificity. But Alonzo would say, I'm just going to assume that you're a genius, right? Like he's like, why should I spend our time together working on that? That's your job. That's what you've been spending your whole life working on. Why should we work on that together? I want to work on the ideas. So one way that I think of this is, in a transactional system, it's like, here's where you need to be, and this is how you measure up, and then you match it, right? You find the right frequency. Alonzo, for me, was saying, here's where I want you to be, and you have to match it. Within that has to be a sustainable rise. The form, this axis, has to still be based in the form and the technique and the data and the information. But how you get to that rise is equal parts the intrinsic, the subjective, and what you're bringing to the step. So I'm going to say the same thing to you today that Alonzo said to me. I'm just going to assume that you all are genius, right? You're here, you work for this company, you're very good at what you do. So the gist of today's talk, the utility of the creative process, is not just how are you exercising mastery in terms of how you execute or implement or even continue growing, but how are you tapping into that next level of what's possible. So I always like to joke that creativity is 2/3 reality, 1/3 possibility, right? Now, if you're in this gaseous state, it's like 3/3 possibility. But if you're over here in the solid state, it's 3/3 reality. You need to be in a fluid, agile state. Again, to quote Stephen Johnson, fluid systems. The way I think of it is 1 foot planted in the ground. This is the technique, your training, your knowledge, your inheritance, tradition, assets, resources, everything that you can measure. But with this other foot, you want to be constantly challenging yourself to be finding and seeking, going into the unknown, right? So the Venn diagram of like the known and the unknown, it's that thin layer of overlap. That's where possibility lies. That's where quote unquote innovation lies. And what's innovation? It's just creativity monetized, right? So how do you tap into that unknown and then bring it back to the known? How are you challenging yourself to be reaching out and gathering this data, this information? Alonzo would always say that it's just information. Without judgment, just see it as possibility. Without bias, allow it to come in. The beauty is the known, the portion that is the known, continues to grow. Throughout your life, it continues to expand. The unknown is infinite. What you don't know, or what we collectively don't know, is infinite. So how do you train yourself with still a grounding and a sense of purpose, be tapping into that adjacent possible, what could be? I call that the creative process. So the creative process is not one or the other, it's both in equal measure. There's a famous psychologist from the University of Chicago, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. He wrote the book Flow, he wrote the book Creativity. So how do you find that flow state? He thought about it and talks about it as sort of another XY axis. On this axis is the given demands of a situation, how you have to measure up. And on this axis is your proclivity or ability or aptitude for that given situation. So if the demands are very high and your ability is low, you probably have anxiety, right? If your ability is very high and the demands are low, you probably have apathy. But how are you in a given moment, like arriving at that optimal flow state? So again, a choreographer in the dance world gives you the steps, gives you sometimes the meaning, the musicality. They create the structure. That's the data, the extrinsic, the quantitative. You can't change that. You can't violate it. And like Alonzo would say, I don't want to see the steps, I want to see the ideas. What are you going to do with it? What you do with it, that's art making. It's not just how well you went out on stage and did those steps. It's how you made them prescient and available and spontaneous in this moment. So I now work at the University of Chicago, the Booth School of Business. I'm the first visiting artist and social entrepreneur. It's a bunch of words, right? Like, it takes me a while to say them. We're making this up as we go. The cool thing is, University of Chicago Booth School of Business is not necessarily known for being the most fluid state environment. They are known for being the most conservative business school in the world, where free market capitalism was invented. But even within that very, in some ways, solid state environment, there are some brilliant teachers and educators. One in particular, a man named Harry Davis, who's been there 53 years. And he's been teaching the impact of the arts on business for longer than I've been alive. And so we met, and in one meeting he said, what would it look like if you came and started playing in this environment? So I've been there 2.5 years now. I question a lot of times, like, why did I make this decision? Why did I choose to go into this environment in which we don't really speak the same language, right? And kind of in hindsight, 2.5 years in, it's understanding how these ideas I knew as an artist and as a dancer, these ideas of creative process, can be translated and become applicable in different scenarios. I'm skipping over a crucial element, which was I also co-founded and ran as the executive director for a decade my own dance company. So for a decade, I was dancing while having to bring in millions of dollars a year. I was the booking agent. I managed a board of directors. I managed a staff. I philanthropically was raising money while dancing. And it was during that time I left Alonzo's tutelage, this man that was incredibly brilliant and had really allowed me to tap into this, and we'll say more in it throughout our conversation, this idea of creative process. And for the first time I was in a scenario where, as the executive director, I was pretty young, early 20s. I didn't really know what I was doing. But I had to begin to learn how to apply these same concepts. How do you go about raising $2 million a year? I sat with people and they said, well, you break it into buckets. How much are you going to raise from individuals, from foundations, from government, from corporations? How many from special events? How much is, fee for services, for touring? How much is education? You break it into the buckets and you make this budget at the beginning of the year, and your board of directors, approved. Here's your budget. And then I remember the first year I was like, oh crap, like how do I do this? How do I suddenly conjure up this money? So how do you deal with the unknown? Another way of saying it is risk. How do you deal with risk? Most systems try to minimize risk to such a degree that we strategize before the process, before you implement. You've strategized exactly how this will play out, and you've tried to minimize the risk to the degree you could, that when you implement, everything's going to follow a pretty set system, right? Being an artist and working with Alonzo, by doing that, if I went out on stage and just only did the steps, right? You've robbed yourself of all that input. You've robbed yourself of all that possibility. If you're only sort of working in the known in a derivative system that's been laid out, you're not allowing yourself to be able to bring in and sort of channel all this other information. I love to go back and spend time with Alonzo. A couple months ago, I was in the studio observing, and the choreography was this female dancer, beautiful. She's 6'1", long limbs. The choreography was that she had to walk forward and then just stand for a moment. And then at the right moment, she had to launch into this very dramatic, big solo. Huge, expansive. It was all about power and how you were exercising all these faculties and a lot of articulation. But she walked forward and she was like a horse at the gate, just ready to go. And then she started, and Alonzo stopped and he said, you have to come forward and you have to have a moment where you let it all go. In Zen Buddhism, they call that beginner's mind. Like, you can't know what you're about to do. You almost have to choose to not know, so that you can be present, so that you can allow what's about to happen to work on you as much as you're about to work on it. So a second ago when I said I said listening and telling, like, you can't just get out there and tell, like, I'm showing you all these steps and here's what it is. Because the human condition is such that in any given moment, you don't know most of what's going to happen. And if you're not making yourself available to that kind of unknown, if you're not listening, you're sort of robbing yourself of what's possible. So right now, I'm sitting here telling things towards you. I'm saying a bunch of words. This is actually very much a conversation. Maybe because I am a ballet dancer, I know who's into it. I know who's checking their phone. I know who's taking notes and who's actually doing email. I can tell, like, when you lean in when I say something that was of import and when you sort of drift off again. And this is a dialogue. And so I'm sort of exercising my own creative process at this moment of, I don't know what I'm going to say to you. I have a grab bag of quotes and stories and pieces of data that I could tell you. But for this to be really a moment that we're sharing, like a present moment, where we're really hopefully arriving at something together and not just this transaction where I'm sending out information and you're absorbing it and hopefully processing. If it's really going to be something more aspirational and we're building something in this collective, collaborative moment, I have to be present. Presence is sort of another way of talking about the creative process. It's that balance of all these things. You can't just come in and know what you're going to say and say it. It has to be a relationship that we're having right now. So in my current line of work, I consult for hedge funds and companies and civic governments. I coach MBAs, I coach entrepreneurs, I teach workshops and classes on similar themes, similar things I'm saying to you today, but a lot of them have real world applications. So I work with teams, companies, to help them identify what is your creative process. And what's interesting is people always think I'm going to show up and sort of give them, 10-step list. Do these 10 things and you too can be creative. I work with a man at the University of Chicago who runs the Center for Wisdom Research. And he said something really fascinating. So there's no such thing as a wise person. There's only wise choices. So I think that applies. There's no such thing as a creative person. There's only creative choices. So creativity is maybe if you're in one given day you made majority creative choices, you might be a creative person for that day. Maybe in a year, if you are exercising creative choice making, but below that level of creative choice making is what I'm calling this creative process. It's that internal balance of how you're seeing a given situation, being adaptable, responding to it, and then arriving at that, again, 2/3 reality, 1/3 possibility. How are you sort of arriving at that what's possible? That's what creative choice making is. It's not the derivative system. It's not the sort of staid, here's what we've already figured out, just implement system. It's here's what I know and here's what could happen. So how are you making creative choices? How are you exercising that creative process to arrive at this balance? It's not an additive process, I've found. Like Alonzo said, you have to walk forward and you actually have to let go. There's another expression in Zen Buddhism that the water is going to flow, like if a stream or a river is already flowing, it's going to flow. It's can you remove more and more rocks to allow it to flow even more, to flow even more smoothly. So the creative process, as I think about it when I consult for these companies, is really a reductive process. What are you doing that's preventing you from kind of accessing all that information? What are your internal biases? What are the rules or obligations or constraints that you think you have to live by? What are the behaviors or ways that you show up that you think are expected of you? Why are you, creativity is also just the ability to see one thing from multiple perspectives and exercise empathy to see the bigger picture and then arrive at a creative choice, which might be, we're going to take all that information, all that data, and then we're going to sort of arrive at, but what is the most interesting or new or unexpected way to now display this hand moving forward into the world? It's usually a reductive process in the sense that the information's already there. Sometimes you're just not seeing it. Or sometimes you're not letting yourself believe that that could be the answer. Or sometimes you're just, we all are getting more caught up in the form and what we can be measured against, rather than that next thing that is amorphous and not fully formed and shaped yet. That's one of the biggest hindrances I see when I consult for more solid state organizations, corporations, civic governments. I remember there was a company here in Chicago that had me come in to help them be more innovative. And they said, well, we tried to be innovative. We created this whole system where people would be incentivized and they'd get paid extra if they were innovative and if they came up with new ideas and new potentials. And he said it failed miserably. Nobody was willing to take risk. No one was willing to go there. Because in the end, a lot of times, we as humans will do the thing we know we can be measured on, right? We do the thing, we invest the time, the resources, the energy, as long as we know that at the end what we did is worthwhile because it measures up to certain existing standards. It's very hard to sort of move beyond the standards and step out. And with this analogy of the one foot planted and the other foot searching, it's not that you just suddenly go into a free fall. It's that you're challenging yourself to kind of always be on that space in between, right? The space in between this action and this action. There's so much information right there in between. I was getting my foot x-rayed recently, and the doctor said, you have really good cartilage. So how can you tell? Because on an x-ray, it's just, black and white. He said there was a lot of space in between the bones. I was like, oh, that's what I'm getting at here. The creative process is this piece of cartilage, it's that buffer. In the brain, they call it the corpus callosum, the webbing that's connecting the right and left sides of the brain. For decades, or even a century now, we knew about the corpus callosum, and neuroscientists and doctors didn't think it had any purpose because it didn't light up in the way that other parts of the brain were. So they actually would sever it in certain types of patients. People with epilepsy, they found if they severed the corpus callosum, the seizures would be less. But what started to happen was people began to have, they were robbed of certain forms of emotional reasoning. Their EQ was diminished. Their IQ stayed intact, but other ways of perceiving diminished. So this webbing, this space in between where you don't really know what it is and where it goes. So this is the thing with a lot of these companies. How do you invest time, resources, energy in the unknown? How do you set aside, and now obviously here at Google, there are practices and methods for which Google has done that historically. How do you set aside, what is it now, is it 20% time still? I always forget. Yeah. How do you incentivize people having unformed time? How do you give people permission to delve into that space? How do you give people permission to not be productive? Our analytic mind operates a lot of times off of alpha waves, and it's all about the action steps, the action skills. The insightful mind is a different part of your brain that operates a lot of time off of gamma waves. It can only be active when the alpha waves, the analytic mind is at rest. So that's why you always get those quotes of, it came to them in the shower, or it came to them while they were going for a walk. It's because the moment you take your mind off of this, the action, the step, the thought, your unconscious keeps working on it, and then that insight pops up. So how do you train, I think, let's start chatting now. How do you train your mind to practice insightful thinking versus analytic thinking. How do you train your mind to sort of step into the unknown, still grounded in the known, and be able to bring that information back? How do you exercise your own personal creative process? And what I do for a living is I help individuals think about that, and then I help them think about how we do it as a team and as an organization and all those layers. But I find usually people eradicate the creative process very quickly because they keep reverting back to what can be measured and what can be stated unequivocally. So I think I'll pose that as a question. How do you practice a creative process? You can answer, anyone can answer. Yes, sir.
By imposing deadlines, by giving myself false deadlines that I have to stick to. Usually I find out work best for us.
False deadlines. I like that. Yeah. Anyone else? Yes?
I think for me, it came down to the permission thing. So I'll like set time in my calendar actually to like set aside for that sort of thinking, to actually explicitly give yourself permission to do it. So you actually feel like you still time managed, so you're going to get the things done you need to get done, and you don't feel as bad at allotting that time to just kind of that creative thinking.
Yeah, I love that. I do both those things as well. Every day for me, I have an hour block on my calendar that's just like unknown time. But I put it there sometimes months in advance so I don't violate it later. And I also put these arbitrary deadlines on my calendar. I'm a very visual person, so my calendar is like, God. What else?
I think when you think about creativity, it's something that as kids it's something we just naturally do, and as we grow older, school, whatever, you sort of lose that habit. I think one of the stories that I've heard is that for those people that have kids, right, they bring this crazy drawing, and as a parent, you're not going to be like, that's the ugliest house I've ever seen, right? Quite the opposite. You tell kids, that's the most beautiful house I've seen in my entire life. That's like that creativity that once you sort of get into the real world, you sort of lose the ability to be able to do that because of the thing you talk about, risk, right? But if it's not done right, then I shouldn't do it. So for me, it's like where I identify what I'm passionate about and carving time to do that, whether it's reading or running, something that sort of strikes that part of my brain.
Yeah, I heard a story recently. A teacher said, "What are you drawing, Susie?" She's like, "I'm drawing a picture of God." She's like, "Honey, no one knows what God looks like." She's like, "They're about to." Like, it's the idea that that my perspective is equal or valuable, and giving yourself permission for it. Yeah, you had your hand up.
See, me, I've heard this expression once: interesting input makes for interesting output.
Mm-hmm.
So when I'm trying to access kind of the insightful mind, I give myself permission just to take in the input that inspires me.
Yeah. Permission giving is really hard sometimes to give to ourselves. Because again, we can default back to all the things that we know we have to do or should do. I call them the coulds and the shoulds. Like, we know what we should go do, and we know what we could go do because we have the aptitude or the ability or the opportunity. It's often hard to give equal weight to the want. Like, what do I want to go do? And oftentimes, but the best information comes from, again, intrinsically motivated, or carving out the time to give yourself permission to just put food in your head.
Can you talk a little bit? Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like, both as a person, how do you give yourself permission? But then maybe in your role as consulting other companies, how do you sort of go up to an organization that's done things for the past 10 years and it's worked well, and ask them to give permission to try something new? Like, what's that first step look like?
Well, sometimes it's good just to frame it as in, let's agree on some universal truths, like change is constant. So just as any system is already becoming antiquated with every day, right? So you have to be generating new potential ways of seeing. It's not about new ways of implementing, but it is definitely new ways of are you staying always aware that you're absorbing more and more information? Now, analytics is a great way to do it, this balance of form and feeling. The quant side is super important because it's how we're going and gathering information and bringing it in. But then again, what do you do with that data? How do you process it? So a lot of companies will say, oh, our system's working. But if we all know, if you're not always sort of tapping in again into that adjacent possible, if you're not always living on that sort of precipice that we keep talking about, you will quickly be antiquated. That's just going to happen. So usually I can frame it in that way for them, and they're like, oh yeah, we can accept that as a truth. And the next step is getting them to realize how they're already giving themselves permission to make creative choices, or how they're already doing it, so how can I help them reinforce that that's a really valid thing. But usually it falls in that, again, that space in between. It's not like a system they have in place. Like, you work for one of the few companies in the world that have systems for those sorts of things. Most companies don't. So getting them to acknowledge, it's always the like amazing to have it skill, but no one knows how to teach it. I think you can teach all those things. You can train them. Those are skills that you can work on. So it's, and I hate the expression soft skills, because it's not hard, it's not real, but it usually lies more in that qualitative soft side. So I usually get them to think about how they're already doing it, or the individuals in their midst that are already doing it. I try to help champion. I mean, I'm completely, it's a bit subversive, but it's not. Like, I think we should be elevating creative thinkers to be leaders, civically, in corporations. I think every board of directors should have an artist sitting at the table, someone that really holds the space for creative process. Because you already have at the table 10 dudes who speak money and finance, and you've got people that speak legalities, and you have scientists and engineers, and you have people that deal in liability and insurance, but you don't always carve out a space for that person who really practices a creative process at a very heightened level. So I try to find the people that are already doing it, especially the ones that are already in senior positions, and help sort of like fortify that what they've done is super worthwhile. A lot of times everyone knows it, but they haven't really like built a system around it, or like incentivized it in a way that allows others to feel they too can be that way. We always fall back on it. Like in a law firm that I was working with, one senior partner was like incredibly, creative, and everyone like praised him. He was the Steve Jobs of law. Somehow he broke all the rules, and he went and did all these things in a way no one had ever done it before. But when you talk to the junior associates and whatnot, why don't you act more like him? Well, I can't, because he's a senior partner, and he has all these permissions I don't have, and he can do things in this way. People think that you chew the fat, you do the work, and then you get to a level of status, and then you can start to exercise creative process. I think it's more like a well-marbled piece of meat. Like, you have to be practicing this creative process. The best piece of the cut of meat has like the fat and the meat all together. It's more flavorful, it's more valuable. But we think, we're just going to do this very left brain way of doing things, and then we can get to that. And when I mentor MBAs and whatnot, I say, if you don't start practicing that skill now, it won't be available to you at 45. So junior associates think, I don't have that permission. And so I say, well, I've been hired to come here to tell you you do. So it's permission giving, but it's permission giving over and over and over again, and it's helping them understand all the ways they're not giving themselves permission. Why did they stop at that moment? And it's usually, again, because they have some idea that someone else is going to tell them they can't do it. And that's almost never the case. Yes?
What are some of the things that have been really have stood out to you when working with these more traditional and financial companies, for example, of when you have spotted creativity in leadership? What does that look like? Like, I guess, kind of, what's a good example of how a corporation can like weave in that creativity really well in the context of a non-traditionally creative company?
Yeah. On a human level, it's usually the person that's listening the most and practicing epistemic humility, which is a term meaning like choosing to be humble. It's the person that's choosing to practice beginner's mind and not know. They might be the most senior, brilliant person. So what's the difference between a smart choice and a wise choice and a creative choice? This is what one of my colleagues at the University of Chicago works on. Like, a smart choice is what we all are trained to do in our education system. Like, it's more analytic, it's more like you add up these things and you arrive at the solution. I've already talked a bit about creative choice making, which is like that overlap of the Venn diagram and the possibility, and you can tap into that what's possible. That's more of a creative choice because you're allowing yourself to open up to the unknown. Wise choice making, and everyone knows Maslow's hierarchy of needs. At some point you've seen that pyramid. Wise choice making is sort of the top pinnacle, helping others unlock their full potential. Pro-sociality, another key component of wise choice making, is epistemic humility, which is the ability to like not exercise ego in choice making, and also to be available to others. Warren Buffett says, I spend most of my time thinking, just sitting there. It's not measurable. Now, of course, he has these outputs that are amazing, so we're all like, well, it's all more like Warren Buffett, but why do more people not just spend time letting their unconscious mind be at play? So when I find it in these companies, again, someone at a high level is practicing more what I would call wise choice making, which has built into it smart choice making, which is level 5 of Maslow's, and creative choice making, which I would say is level 7 of Maslow's. Like but again, it's more of an allowing, a permission giving they give to themselves. And then the companies, even like solid state, traditional companies that seem to do it well, they don't always presuppose that their status, their power, their market share is permanent. And they are very open to possibility. They don't rule out ideas right away. They don't have as much judgment about when an idea comes up. They give it weight, they give it time, within reason. Because this is where you start to then run into time management and systems management and all those other things. But one of the hedge funds I work with, a brilliant man, it's actually a mutual fund, he said, I never sought to make money. I never sought growth. And now he's a billionaire. But he said, I just wanted to do cool things that were interesting to me. So there's a lot of behavioral science now that shows if you seek the reward, the extrinsic reward, you rob yourself of the intrinsic creative process. If you seek the intrinsic creative process, you're more self-fulfilled and happy, and then if you still get the reward, it's a bonus. But we set up a lot of our systems to be measuring what's the outcome going to be. I'm just going to work towards that, and they've robbed themselves of the process. Jess, you had something?
I was just interested to hear your perspective or point of view on like expectations, because I feel like sometimes that hinders me creatively when I set either unrealistic or somehow not, for whatever parameter, not realistic expectations, and then I feel like I didn't deliver, which creates like something else that happens, or like a more dominant spiral.
Yeah.
So I think I've gotten better at it, but it's really hard to create realistic expectations that are still like, impactful.
Yeah. I think people are really good at naming the coulds and the shoulds, like what they should do and what they could do, and then they often make that their entire expectation setting. And so how do you factor in from the onset, from the beginning, the outset, also the intrinsic motivation? I find that we often set up the expectation with our boss, or with our employer, or with ourselves, or with others, that's all based on sort of others' expectations of you and not your expectations of yourself. It's kind of a pat answer, but I'll say more later because I know you and we can talk more. But I think we're kind of coming up at the end of time. Does anyone have one more question? And if not, I just want to say thanks for hanging out for an hour or so. And of course, it's very exciting what Google does. And that's why I was excited to come and chat with y'all today, because I know I'm preaching to the choir in a lot of respects, but it's always fascinating to kind of come into different environments and hear what you're thinking on. So I'd love to continue the dialogue with any of you if you want to chat now or just email and chat later. But thanks so much.
Yeah.